Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. 7.5 years into the Syrian conflict, forces loyal to President Bashar Assad have managed to gain a decisive upper hand in the fight vis-a-vis various rebel militias and extreme Muslim groups. To provide you with a status report on the latest developments in Syria, I'm joined here in the studio by Lieutenant Colonel in Reserve, Reuven Ben Shalom, who is a cross-cultural strategist and a columnist at the Jerusalem Post. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren.
Hello.
And Brigadier General in Reserve, Yossi Kupelwasser, who is the project director on Middle Eastern developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. And I'd like also to welcome Professor Zev Chanin, who is an expert on Russian and Middle Eastern studies at Bar Ilan and Ariel University. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us an intro to the latest developments.
Early next month, on September the 6th, the Syrian civil war will mark its 7.5-year anniversary. And it's been a long time, and it seems as if the Syrian conflict is gradually grinding to a halt. Not yet, but this is the general direction. And the question is, will it revert to what it used to be before it all started on March the 6th, 2011, or will we see a new Syria altogether? Will the players which have gone into Syria during this time, Hezbollah, Iran, Turkey, the Islamic State, various other groups, are they going to leave out of their own volition? We know that the Americans want to leave, that this is their stated goal, but will the other groups leave? What will the Russians do? How will Israel and Jordan react? Right now, in the stage in which we are, it seems as if the Assad forces, backed by Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and various Shiite militias, have gained control over Damascus and its environs, also the southwest area, including the one bordering the Israeli-held Golan Heights, and the fight is now focused on Idlib, the province in the north, which is also close to Turkey and which could bring Turkey and the Assad regime, and perhaps its backers too, into conflict.
Colonel Ben Shalom.
I think it's interesting that so many players in such a complicated arena, yet the picture is so clear. At least now, at this point, it's clear, because we know where it's going. The Assad regime have won with the support, with the backing of Iran and Russia. And in a way, it's almost clear that we're going back to what we had before. I have to tell you that as an Israeli, I feel a serious conflict inside, because we can't have a discussion about Syria without reminding that this was a terrible humanitarian suffering of our neighbors. Many people killed and displaced. And after all that, what did they or the rebels or whoever wanted this achieve? Absolutely nothing. They lost. So back to square one. So why is there a conflict? Because as an Israeli, in a way, I can expect now to go back to a situation where we have decades of a quiet border. The only issue, of course, and the main issue for Israel now is shaping this area as far as how it fits into the axis. It has always been part of the axis, for instance, supplying Hezbollah by Iran through Damascus International Airport. And now we're talking about the presence of Iran. So, of course, this is still a big question mark, but basically we understand where this is headed.
General Kupelwasser.
Well, first of all, I don't think that we are coming back to the status quo ante. Syria has changed dramatically. And the new Syria we're facing is a Syria, first of all, where it's clear that Assad does not represent his people. There's a rift between Assad and the people, and what happened during those 7.5 years is going to have an impact on his ability to really rule Syria for a long time. 500,000 people were killed. Let's not just mention the numbers of the displaced and so on and so forth. Secondly, it's not Assad who actually rules Syria. He is allowed to rule Syria in those areas and the issues that are important for him. But the real forces who rule Syria today are the Iranians and the Russians for their purposes. And from an Israeli point of view, this is extremely disturbing, because for Iran, one major goal is to keep Assad in power. But beyond that, it's to turn Syria into a jumping boat for promoting Iranian interests in the region. Amongst them, in a very good place, is improving their ability to take all kinds of actions against Israel. So it's a totally new situation. But it's also new, just one last remark. It's also a totally new situation in the kind of relations that we have today with the Syrian people and with the Sunni pragmatic states. Israel is the only state that was there for the pragmatic states working against Iran and still working against Iran in Syria. They appreciate it, they know what it means. And the people of Syria also learned a lesson. Israel is not their enemy. Israel is their friend, with limited capability to intervene in a civil war.
And as we continue in this show, we will definitely dig deeper into the meanings of the current reality for Israel. Professor Khanin, how do you perceive the current reality?
In the course of the recent years, we were talking about three models. The first model that Syria, the country, will be dispersed according to along the same lines that it was artificially engineered after the First World War. The second scenario, that everything will come back to the situation of pre-2011, and Mr. Assad will rule this country with this or that implication and concern of the various parties that are involved into the Syrian issue. And the third scenario, that actually is the combination of first two. Officially, it's going to be one country, but inside, under this umbrella, there will be different subjects and the different blocks and territories that will be ruled by the local elites and controlled by the local field commanders, will have their own patrons from outside, from abroad, and Mr. Assad will be like an official leader or somebody who will come after Mr. Assad, and different superpowers that are involved here in the Middle East, regional superpowers and international superpowers, will compete for control over the official Damascus. Israel, from this point of view, will actually could gain and lose from any of this scenario. If we will suppose that the first scenario is out, that Syria is going to be like a sort of a officially unified country with representation in the United Nations, the flag and capital, and so on and so forth. So we are trying to look for our way between the second and third one. Suppose that the most probably will be the third one. From Israel point of view, now is the question whether we should balance between the parties, the subjects that are involved in the war at the moment, and then will compete for peace, in war for peace, after it will be decided that the war is over. It's like a renovation of the building, it's impossible to finish, it's impossible to stop. So after that will be stopped. So we should compete, or she would find our way to balance between the parties inside or superpowers, whom we should cooperate with. United States, Sunni regime, Turkey, Moscow, or all of them, or two of them.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to touch base on a topic that some of you have also mentioned, the refugee crisis, which has become actually the severest refugee crisis since World War II, significantly impacting the domestic power balance of the different ethnic backgrounds and religions, but also has brought about a flood of refugees to Europe and elsewhere. Turkey, of course, was the most hospitable, if you will, with regard to refugees flooding into its border. But now that the new reality is coming to the ground, will we start seeing the flood of these refugees returning home to old Syria?
Probably, because people want to go home, even though there are possibilities abroad, though not all European countries offer shelter, and of course citizenship is far down the road. So yes, the majority will probably want to go home. They will have to reestablish their neighborhoods. They will find that it is mostly in ruins, and incidentally, Israel could have hoped at one time that this new refugee problem would be so overwhelming that the old Palestinian refugee problem will be looked at proportionately. Up until the Iraq war, at least, of course, Iraq also produced many refugees and displaced, but up until the Iraq war, the Palestinian refugees of 1948 and some of 1967 were considered the refugees of the Middle East, and their problem was most prominent. But it is not so any longer. But there is also another problem which may not be totally adjacent to that. And that is that whatever political formula will be found at Geneva between Assad and the opposition, it will probably have to do with the division of power within Syria, society, economy, and the like. Foreign policy and national security is still going to be held by the regime and its backers. And if they decide to re-establish the Syrian armed forces, the Syrian Air Force, the Syrian ground-to-air air defense system, and the armored divisions, they can do it. They can provide the equipment, they can provide the training, and within 3 or 4 years, we will find the Syrian army, which was the main threat when General Kupperwasser was the head of research and assessments for military intelligence. We will find it again sitting across the Golan Heights from the Israeli Defense Forces as the major threat.
A point also made by Israeli Defense Minister Victor Lieberman. Colonel Ben Shalom, how do you perceive this?
I think there will be a return. I can't say if all, but I think there will be significant numbers going home. It will be interesting also to see, when and how this happens, and also it depends from what countries. Refugees in Turkey, by the way, I think are going to be coming home after an interesting indoctrination, because remember that Turkey's leader has a very important mission for himself to be perceived as the leader of the Muslim world, and that's also his actions in northern Syria are to promote this. I think what's going to be disappointing, unfortunately, is that the international community will not get together now and garner support and garner funds to re-establish Syria, although we saw international powers intervening in order to tip the scale, of course, Iran and Russia. I don't think we're going to see now Russia taking over the civilian efforts as far as funds. Iran, there's nothing to talk about because their meager resources are into their operating their military or their militias inside of Syria. So I'm not sure how this is going to happen. I agree with Mr. Oren, by the way, that this will bring an interesting contrast to the ridiculous situation that for many years UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Organization or agency, has been sustaining the so-called Palestinian problem and even amplifying it. And now it will seem, the contrast will be so overwhelming that the question should be raised, wait a second, is there even place for UNRWA? Shouldn't we have all of this under one umbrella and divert international efforts, not to sustaining a terror
There is
platform?
such an umbrella, the High Commissioner for
Of course. So what I mean is cancel UNRWA, bring it all under the commissioner, and divert attention and resources now to help Syria get back on its feet.
General Kupperwasser?
Well, I think that things are happening in this context of refugees still, even though some of them are going to come back. First of all, Syria today is going to be divided into areas that each one of them has a different color from a population point of view. And the Kurds, for example, are now ruling the areas where they live, and they are not really looking forward to join hands with the Assad regime. They cooperate, but they want to retain their independence. Same still happens in the Idlib area. It's ruled by Sunni Muslim forces, supported by Turkey. There's a big effort to take this area over, but it's not going to be that easy. We're still talking about big numbers of fighters over there. In the areas that are now controlled by Assad, there was a tendency to bring in Shiites from all over the areas that are under Iranian influence. So not everybody can come home, actually. Some of these areas are now populated by newcomers. And this is also transparent in the fact that new forces were brought in. Those Shiite forces that are loyal to Iran are on the field. They are deployed, and they are going to help see this process move forward. So the issue of the population is not solved yet, even if the military aspect is more or less decided. Much depends on what's going to happen with Iran. And this was mentioned here, the more they are preoccupied with their own problems at home, and this seems to be the direction right now, then it's going to be more difficult for them to sustain their investment in Syria. But we have to remember, for them, this is such a high priority. Even if they have to suffer at home, they will still, at this point, try to keep this new asset that is so important for them.
Professor Khanin?
From the Israeli point of view, as far as this is the situation, there are three issues concerning the question what will be afterwards. Actually, about many of them, Yossi wrote extensively in his articles. First issue, what will happen with the Golan Heights afterwards? Whether the new or new old civil government, which will officially rule in Damascus, will raise the question of returning of the Golan Heights back to Syria as if nothing happened in the course of this decade. The second question, of course, is the question of refugees. Not only all of them, or even most of them, will be able to come back to their homes, and concerning, if we are talking about those who are displaced persons within Syria, but also all these millions or hundreds of thousands of, or how much of them, of people that came to other states and other countries.
Several millions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Russians actually were clever enough to receive only 2 refugees, not 2,000, not 2 million, but 2 people. But the rest of them, in spite of the fact they're very heavily involved in the Assad issues in Syria and so on and so forth. But many, in concern of so many of them who are in Europe at the moment, I don't believe the majority would love to come back or will be able to come back. Mm-hmm. And the third issue is actually the question of demand of all the subjects and all the forces that in the Syria illegally, meaning not by the invitation or on the invitation of the official government, should leave. Who is there not on the invitation or on the invitation? Each side sees the situation differently. Americans say that actually everybody should leave. Iranians, Russians, anybody. Turks, please out here. From a Russian point of view, there are only 2 forces that are on the invitation. That actually Iranians and them. And from their Israeli point of view, some cynics would say that probably the Assad regime is there, not on the invitation of the local people. However, that all the subject that most probably, we have to deal also in the next decade.
Well, I'd like to move to the next point. As we're speaking, Syrian President Bashar Assad, his forces, as well as their backers, are mobilizing their forces for the next campaign, which is Idlib. Currently, of course, the Air Force of Russia, as well as Syria, are bombing different militant installations across the province there, as well as Western Aleppo and other small pockets. Currently, Idlib under the control of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the most dominant group controlling the different elements in that region. It has strong links with Al-Qaeda and the same ideology for that matter. But Turkey is, of course, interested to maintain some kind of a stability adjacent to its border, not to see President Bashar Assad retain his control of that area. And as part of its efforts to bolster Syrian rebel armies and so on, it established a 36,000 strong army, or the National Army as they call it, which obviously will not just sit idly by, supported by Turkey's goodwill, but will be employed in one way or another. What's happening there, Mr. Olin?
The situation on the ground is shifting so fast that had we published in print a manual depicting both the alliances and the order of battle of each militia, it would have been obsolete even before we would have distributed it, because an organization which fights another one this morning will become its ally in the evening, and many thousands of people were transported from the southwest, where the former main area of the conflict only a few weeks ago, they were transported to Idlib to fight another day. This was a way to relieve pressure on the southwest and to prevent massacres of the civilian population. But
it's important also to know they weren't received in a warm welcome and had to fight their way to retain some territory.
Of course, but now we don't know on whose side they are going to fight, and if what they choose to do today will remain so tomorrow. Now, regarding the southwest, one positive result is that he's had somewhat relieved the pressure on Jordan. When we talked about refugees, it is important to note that Jordan has been under a lot of pressure because it had to absorb some 900,000 or so refugees. They will be asked to go home they will have outstayed their welcome, and the king is not going to suffer their presence once the conflict is over. They are not going to be given any choice. They will be sent home whether they are willing or not. But in the north, we have this strange condition where the Kurds are the allies of the Americans. Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey is fighting the Kurds. Now we have another conflict between Trump and Erdogan. This is supposedly outside the scope of our discussion. But are the Turks going to fight the Americans? They still have some 2,000 advisors there, the Americans. What is going to happen in the Assad-Erdogan relationship? We don't know the answers yet.
Colonel Ben Shalom?
I don't think I have more to add to this complexity, but I will recommend to look at what Erdogan is doing on the ground. And it's not just a matter of taking this area or that area, but it's a prolonged campaign of winning the hearts and minds. And he has a long-term vision of being perceived, of course, as the protector or leader of the Muslim world. And he's working very hard to achieve this. So I think we may see other issues in Syria sort of resolved or straightened. The issue of Erdogan, I think it's a long-term campaign that's far from being resolved. Unfortunately for Israel, our relations with them are not so intimate. We have very good relations with other players in the region. With Turkey, not so much.
But
General-
if he insists on keeping a security zone, a security belt along his southern border or the northern part of Syria, then this whole notion of having all the foreign forces leave is going to be in limbo.
General Kupilasu?
I think what's happening in Idlib is a reflection of the problems of the Syrian opposition for all along this war. They could have won it, but they are so fragmented, so much preoccupied with internal rifts that it's very difficult for them to work together. And on top of that, the most prominent elements within them are those ultra-radicals that cannot expect the Western world to support them. So, and this makes also the trust between the Western world and the less radical questionable. And this, again, brought all this situation. And these are elements of the nature of this opposition that led to its failure, unfortunately. Or fortunately, depends from which side you look at it. Mm-hmm. The other thing, I think that looking at Idlib, one thing is clear. For Israel, as long as the battles were near us, and there's still one battle that's not that far from us, this in Sweda, but putting that aside, now that the battles are not near us, we have to focus on the really important issue right now that was mentioned here by everybody, which is creating the conditions that would lead Iran out. So we have to work together with the Russians, clarify to them again and again that the Iranians there are a source of concern for them and the risk for them. We have to work with the Americans to make sure that they don't leave too early and allow the Iranians use the Abu Kamal Damascus line to provide whatever they want to do in Syria. We have to work militarily day in, day out in order to prevent the Iranians from building their infrastructure inside Syria. Both the infrastructure in the Golan Heights, as was mentioned here, to attack us, and the long-term infrastructure that would be used against us in the future, and that would help Hezbollah against all kinds of weapons. These are the issues that Israel has to focus about right now.
Professor
Idlib is less important.
Well, I would say that from Israeli point of view, we're in a very interesting situation. In Israeli history, probably we could mention a few wars which were so-called unofficial. We had in 1982 the so-called two-day unofficial Israeli-Syrian war, which was a half-a-day unofficial Israeli-Soviet war. And in fact, as generals definitely know, well, that was one of the reasons of the dispersion of the Soviet Union, because it was pretty clear that the Soviet army was unable to deal with the Israel Defense Forces, at least in the Chel Avir, the Air Force, Israeli Air Force. Then we had the first unofficial Israel-Iranian war, which we call Second Lebanon War. And now we are involved in the second Israel unofficial Israel-Iranian war. So the question is whether we can come back to the situation of pre-2011, as the colleague said, that we have a peaceful border, despite of the fact that on the other side there is a regime that not exactly under the banner of the peaceful coexistence, but still understands that they're unable to deal with Israel. I'm asking myself a question, first of all, and maybe colleagues will be able to answer it. whether we could come back to the situation that Israel is not a subject in the Syrian issues.
Well, we're actually drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to focus indeed on Israel and challenges posed. On its border right now, the Syrian army has reasserted its control on the different outposts that it abandoned during the years of the conflict. However, the only main difference between what happened before the war and right now is that we see Russian military police taking up different positions, and already we had the Kremlin announce, among others, that they will establish some military installations in order to keep the peace, as they put it. To what degree is that significant? Is it bad? Is it good for Israel?
It's good for Israel if you think that it's worthwhile for Israel to return the Golan Heights for peace. It is not so good if you think that Israel has to hold onto the Golan Heights, because apparently the Russians are going to insist at least on reigniting the peace process. Whether they will push later is something else.
On the symbolic level, totally.
Symbolic is fine. Now, in 1967, the Russians, the Soviets, have cut off relations with Israel when they feared that Israel is approaching Damascus. In 1973, we didn't have relations with Moscow. We didn't know that Damascus is attacking us, as well as Cairo. And now, again, the Russian element is probably the most intriguing one in the Syrian-Israeli relationship.
Colonel Ben Shalom, shortly.
Our intimate relationship with Russia is an asset for us. We have a good dialogue with them, good coordination on the ground. And there are other aspects that are happening now, like the return of UNDOF, and we're going to see more stabilizers. Iran is the wild card, and I think Israel's policy is correct. Still, even if Iran is there at a certain presence, it's not an existential threat to Israel.
General Kupelwasser, also shortly.
Not an existential threat, but it is a threat, and we have to remember that even if the Russians promise us that the 80 kilometers will be without Iranian presence, this is not the case, because the Iranians are using Syrian fatigues with the people that are working for them, so this is not going to work. We have to make sure that Iran is out with all the forces that belong to it. That's the most important thing.
Professor Khanin, closing sentence.
Yeah, we should not forget that Israel is a partner of Russia, but not an ally, which means that different things will kick out all the time and will be decided ad hoc, but we still have to think about the strategy.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, unfortunately, and this topic is, even though the armed conflict seems to come to a certain end, at least, this is far from over, so I'd like to thank Colonel Ben Shalom, Mr. Oren, General Kupelwasser, and Professor Khanin for being here today, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you again on Friday at the same time. You just watched Jerusalem Studio. If you were enriched by the program, please consider supporting Heaven TV 7 Jerusalem. Call us at 0600 101 77 or send your donation using the bank account number on the screen. You can also donate via PayPal. Jerusalem Studio is made possible by your donations.